Welcome to Science of Slink, the evidence-based poll podcast with me, your host, Dr. Rosie Boa. And just to be very clear, I'm not a medical doctor. I cannot treat or diagnose. I'm the type of doctor that does research and reads research articles. And that's part of what we're going to be doing together here in the podcast. We're going to be reading research. We're going to be synthesizing that down into things that you can apply to your poll practice. We're going to be talking with experts in their field and learning more. And overall, just really building our understanding of how bodies work, how we can do poll better, train more effectively, train more safely, and just have a better time overall. So if that sounds like something you're interested in and you want to come get a little bit nerdy with us, come on in. So I was going to talk today about some of the research that's been done around high heels. And as I was doing a little bit of a literature review, I realized that a lot of that literature is actually of very poor quality. And so I think it might be helpful to instead zoom out a little bit, really get sciencey, and talk about the replication crisis and how it's affected some of the fields that do look at pole dancing and related things, just so that if you're ever doing your own, investigation into these areas, you have some clearer understanding of the social background, right? And the scientific background. Because just because a study was published somewhere does not mean that the results are reliable, right? So we've talked before about, I don't remember what episode it was in, but we definitely talked about predatory journals, right? And sometimes scientific publishers are really just doing it to make money, and other times they're predatory journals. Ha-cha-cha. Take that, SLVA. Anyway, science joke. But let's get in our time machines. Let's rewind to the early 2010s. And in the early 2010s, there were a series of pretty big studies that were done to try to quantify the effects, right? Like the effect size and the reliability of certain psychological phenomena that had been described in previous studies, right? So there were a number of things that, as a result of these repeated studies and further work, were found not to actually replicate. So things that had been pretty widely agreed upon within the scientific community, certainly within like the psychological community, people were suddenly like, oh, actually, we don't have good evidence that this is the case, right? So some of those things that you may be familiar with are like ego depletion. So this is idea that like your self-control, your willpower is like a limited resource and you can run out of it. You may have heard, I think a lot of folks have actually heard about that thing where power poses, right? Like if you hold a power pose for a minute before you go to a presentation, you'll feel more confident. That research didn't replicate. So there were a lot of these sort of widely disseminated in popular culture findings that didn't seem to actually be robust enough to always show up, which is the sort of thing that we ideally want to avoid when we're publishing scientific literature, right? Ideally, when you publish a study, right, you have done some sort of controlled intervention and you have fairly good evidence that the effect that you found was not due to chance and can be successfully replicated with a large enough effect size to be useful and interesting across a variety of different situations, right? So you might hear the term ecological validity. It doesn't just work in like our tiny little subsection, it works in a lot more places. So and this whole thing was called the replication crisis. One of the fields where it turns out a lot of things didn't replicate, and if I were being glib, I would say the majority of their findings didn't replicate, is evolutionary psychology. And on its surface, I think that, there's nothing inherently problematic with the idea of, marrying evolution with psychology. But a lot of the studies really ended up being stories about how people who menstruate have wild fluctuations in their behavior based on where they are in their menstrual cycle. And as part of this replication crisis, a lot of work was done to try and, hey, is that true? And it seems like no, the actual effects are pretty limited, and a lot of the things that had been proposed, right, like a lot of things to do with, for example, high heels, and presenting as presumably more sexually attracted to straight cis men, did not actually replicate, and there were not robust effect sizes, and these effects were not reliable across a range of situations. So Am I saying that, nothing in evolutionary psychology is worthwhile? No. But if I'm looking into a topic and I see a lot of EvoPsych papers, especially EvoPsych papers from, say, they kept doing stuff, but like particularly before the mid-2010s, my little like radar goes up and I go, bing, bing. This is something I should dig into a little bit more deeply. So big studies trying to find these effects, finding that like, wait a second, these effects aren't actually reliable. And a lot of it was actually kicked off on accident with grad students trying to replicate super famous studies. Cause like, of course, that's the first thing you do. You'd be like, I'm trying to modify this study. I want to make sure that I can replicate it and that my study design works. Oh, but it doesn't. I'm not seeing the effect. Okay, well, I'll run it again. It still doesn't. I'm not seeing the effect. Okay, I'll run more subjects. It still doesn't. I'm not seeing the effect, right? So that was sort of the zeitgeist at that point. And one of the big things that has come out of that, right, is, or has been at least partially in response to that, is the movement towards open science. So open science is the idea that one of the ways that we can avoid things like p-hacking, so this is manipulating data so that you get, or the way that you are doing testing so that you get stronger statistical effects than you should, given your specific data, is to do things like pre-registration. So before you even run a single participant, you say, here's what my experimental design looks like, here's the participants I want, here's how many I'm going to try to get, here are the exact statistical tests I'm going to do, and I'm going to do those exact tests, and I have said all of this before I even start, and then I'm going to share all of my work as we go through, right? So pre-registration is a big one. Open science, right? Sharing your data so that people can check your calculations for themselves. There are also some pretty big cases of people just making up data to fit their hypotheses that were caught out through people trying to replicate their statistical analysis and being like, there's no way this is naturally occurring data. So also part of open science, right? That data sharing. And of course you have to do that with, sensitivity and concern around the privacy of the people who are, donating data or who are participants in your study, but still very, very important. And there's been a real sort of shift in a lot of the fields related to psychology and around, right? I think medical science, there was as well some work on that where I think a couple big pharmaceutical companies tried to do a large-scale replication study and found pretty small replication rates, right? Sort of in the 10s and 20% bin. And I'm not knowledgeable about medical science, so I will say nothing more about that, but it is, an issue with scientific fields. And one question that we get a lot is why, right? Why is this an issue? Why would people publish things that they weren't 100% sure in? And there's sort of two issues there. So one is what actually gets published. If you do a study and you say, hey, this intervention doesn't have an effect, it is very, very hard to get that study published. It's really only been recently, and there are actually some journals that when you submit a paper, what you are submitting is your description of what you're going to do. And then they just say, okay, you're accepted. No matter what your results are, we're going to publish your work so people can know. So if there's null effect, it's really hard to get something published. And this is known, you'll hear about the file drawer effect. People just won't submit that work because it's unlikely to get published. You'll also hear about publication bias. So more surprising and more extreme results are more likely to get published. And, because there is variance in data that we work with, particularly anything to do with humans. Humans are complex. Social stuff is super complex. Effects tend to be smaller and more variable. Just because there's so much more underlying stuff going on than there is with something like physics, you get, a bias towards publishing things that have a bigger effect. And there's actually, not on an individual study level, but on a publication level, there is a test that you can do that I believe is called the Z-test, different from that Z-test. A good citation developed by Ulrich Schimmick 2014. So again, right, sort of in the middle of this. And this is a way to sort of see, for a given publication, have an estimate of how large their publication bias is. So that's one thing, right? Just like people want to publish interesting stuff, both that's what they submit and also that's what journals accept. And interesting stuff is generally more surprising, generally has a bigger effect size, and is more likely to be the result of variance in the data. And that doesn't necessarily mean that anyone's done anything wrong. And another thing, and again, this doesn't necessarily mean that anyone's done anything wrong, it's more sort of like a larger incentives question, is that there is you may have heard the phrase publish or perish. So if you are a researcher, your job output is number of scientific papers published, right? And you want that number to be as high as possible. And this leads to incentives, right? Like maybe not being quite as careful with your work as you could. There's this incentive to publish as much as possible, as quickly as possible, maybe not as carefully as possible. And you want to avoid having null effects. So there is, of course, an incentive there to have more extreme effects. And in some cases, this has led to scientific misconduct. So I mentioned things like, falsifying data. All of this is to say, it's something that I am pretty sensitive about as a researcher. I was one of them open science nerds. So if you're wondering sort of where I fall on this political spectrum of people who don't think it's an issue to people who do think it's an issue, I do think it's an issue. And I think that openness and pre-registration and things like that are a really important way to help avoid that in the future, particularly when you're dealing with more complex systems. People often compare, studies on humans to, again, physics, and I don't know why. They are not equivalent. One of them is harder and it's not physics. That's just my bias because I work on humans. Anyway, I recently was reading a book. It's a mass market popular science book, and I think I'm actually probably not going to finish it because I realized as I was reading through, A, they said some things that I thought were just like straight out falsifiably wrong, but B, I did notice that they were citing a lot of EvoPsych work and a lot of the work that, again, just hasn't reproduced and does not seem to have robust enough effects that it's worth continuing to travel down that road with our limited ability to do scientific endeavor as a species, at least in my opinion. But obviously I'm not the emperor of the world, right? Like I can't tell people what to do. I don't want to tell people what to do. But if I am, engaging with scientific literature and I'm seeing a lot of that sort of work, for me, again, just sort of puts my radar up. And I'll tell you right now, a lot of the high heels work is sort of in that general set of fields, tends to have some of those qualities. There was also a lot of work on high heels causing bunions or, the sort of the big toe to come in towards the rest of the toes. And that is very much not my understanding what the medical consensus is. The causal work that has been done on bunions, it seems to pretty much just be genetic. Wearing high heels is not going to cause it. And I'll put some citations to that in the show notes as well if you want to dig a little bit more deeply into that literature. And particularly for work that's been done on dancers in point shoes, which are way more extreme than our pole heels. It does not seem to be associated with that shape of foot. Period. That's it. That was the end of the sentence. I don't know why my intonation did that. So anyway. Unfortunately, I can't be like, here's lots of good information about high heels from the literature, because the literature on the topic is generally of poor quality. But I think it's helpful to talk about, right? And a lot of times this work that I do when I'm doing stuff for the podcast, I'm pulling together literature I review, I don't talk about, and I thought it would be helpful to talk about it a little bit so some of the things that I'm thinking about when I'm evaluating studies, being like, is this something I want to tell people? Is this information that I think is worth sharing? Do I think it's going to be high quality and replicable? And do I want to put it on the podcast? So anyway, a little bit of a story time about the replication crisis, about open science, about, again, personally, when I see EvoPsych papers, I tend to get just a little bit more suspicious. I'm not saying that nothing in the field has been useful or helpful, but I will say that they have a lot of stuff that they haven't been able to replicate, again, just as a field. And that if I'm seeing a lot of that in the citations of another paper, I do tend to be a little bit more distrusting of the quality of that paper's work in general, because it suggests to me that they were not being as careful as I would have been in a literature review. So that's what I got to say about that, and I will be back very, very soon. And in the meantime, I hope you're enjoying wearing your heels if you wear heels, and enjoying not wearing them if you don't. And I'll talk to you very, very soon. Bye! Thank you for listening. I hope you learned something. If you want to do more research on your own, if we talked about specific studies, I always try to have the citations in the show notes so you can check them out for yourself. A great place to continue our learning. Speaking of continuing your learning, if you do want to work with me as a pole instructor, I teach online at my online studio, Slink Through Strength, and it would be great to have you come join us. I teach freestyle flow, I teach conditioning, I teach flexibility, and I teach pole in the nerdiest way possible. But we have a good time, and we'd love to have you join us if that sounds like fun for you. And if not, no worries. Either way, I'll see you in the next episode. Have a good one.